China is pushing back hard against what it calls U.S. overreach on the high seas. China's Ministry of Commerce accused Washington of abusing unilateral sanctions and so-called long-arm jurisdiction after Washington announced what it calls a blockade, described by officials as a sanctions enforcement quarantine targeting sanctioned tankers around Venezuela. The ministry stated that arbitrarily intercepting other countries' oil tankers could not only disrupt the normal operation of international energy markets, but also trigger other security risks. Beijing's tone is sharper than usual in its public messaging. That's the way multiple observers and reports are reading it. The remarks came amid reports that U.S. authorities have seized at least one tanker and intercepted others while pursuing an additional vessel tied to Venezuela-linked trade, according to official statements and reporting. The term long-arm jurisdiction is significant in Beijing's criticism. It refers to the U.S. practice of applying its laws and sanctions extraterritorially, beyond American borders, to companies and vessels from other countries operating in international waters. China has long argued that this practice violates international norms and represents an abuse of American power. From Beijing's perspective, the United States is claiming authority to enforce its laws anywhere in the world, on ships flying other countries' flags, carrying cargo owned by foreign companies, in waters far from American shores. This critique resonates with countries that are wary of U.S. power and concerned about the precedents being set by American sanctions enforcement. Chinese officials argue the interceptions could disrupt energy markets and raise security risks, and analysts say uncertainty alone can move prices. This is not just a diplomatic complaint, it is a warning about potential economic consequences. The global energy markets are interconnected. Disruptions in one region, whether the Persian Gulf, the Caribbean, or elsewhere, can affect prices and supply chains worldwide. If the United States is willing to intercept tankers in international waters, shipping companies and traders face new uncertainties. Insurance costs can rise, routes are reconsidered, and the overall stability of maritime commerce is called into question. China's Commerce Ministry has explicitly defended Venezuela's right to trade. The ministry stated it is normal, legal, and reasonable for Venezuela to conduct economic and trade cooperation with other countries within the framework of international laws. And these rights should be respected and supported. This is a direct challenge to U.S. sanctions policy. China is arguing that Venezuela has the sovereign right to sell its oil to whomever it chooses, and that other countries have the right to buy it. Washington disagrees, arguing that its sanctions are legitimate tools to pressure the Maduro government. The fundamental disagreement is unlikely to be resolved. But China's explicit support for Venezuela's trade rights puts Beijing on a collision course with U.S. enforcement efforts. While Washington claims the tankers are linked to sanctions violations, oil industry sources say several of the vessels were bound for China, tied to China-based traders, and carrying Venezuelan crude. Multiple specific vessels have been involved in the U.S. enforcement campaign. Centuries was carrying Venezuelan crude reported as China-bound. Skipper carried Venezuelan oil and was seized earlier as part of the same enforcement push. Another vessel, the Bella One, is described by U.S. officials and maritime risk sources as a sanctioned vessel, reportedly added to the U.S. Treasury sanctions list previously, and is still being pursued. The involvement of multiple tankers and the pattern of actions suggests a sustained campaign rather than isolated enforcement actions. The destinations of the vessels are significant. Oil industry sources say Centuries was carrying Venezuelan crude bound for China. This detail transforms the story from a U.S.-Venezuela dispute into a U.S.-China confrontation. If the United States is seizing tankers carrying oil to China, then Beijing has a direct stake in the outcome, not just as a matter of principle, but as a matter of energy security. China has been a major purchaser of Venezuelan oil despite U.S. sanctions. These purchases help sustain Venezuela's economy and provide China with energy diversification. The tanker seizures directly threaten both of these interests. A tense standoff is unfolding at sea, a drama thousands of miles from Washington. The U.S. Coast Guard is now awaiting reinforcements before it can attempt to board and seize a Venezuela-linked oil tanker. Sources told Reuters the vessel, identified by maritime trackers as the Bella One, has refused a standard boarding, forcing the Coast Guard to wait for specialized teams before any attempt to seize it. Bella 1 is described by U.S. officials and maritime risk sources as a sanctioned vessel, reportedly added to the U.S. Treasury sanctions list previously. What was meant to be a swift enforcement of sanctions has instead exposed a deepening challenge. Reuters sources and officials describe the Coast Guard as stretched thin for this kind of operation, with specialized boarding teams limited and not nearby. The days-long pursuit of the Bella 1 lays bare a stark contradiction. The Trump administration has announced what it calls a blockade, described by officials as a sanctions enforcement quarantine, targeting sanctioned tankers around Venezuela as part of an unprecedented pressure campaign against President Nicolas Maduro's regime. Yet the agency tasked with carrying out much of that mission faces resource constraints. This week, the U.S. Coast Guard seized Venezuela-associated oil tankers in the Caribbean, dramatic helicopter boarding operations that underscored America's resolve. But Bella 1 has refused to comply. Boarding a defiant tanker like Bella 1 isn't a routine task, and it requires elite specialists, maritime security response teams trained to rappel from helicopters onto moving decks and wrest control in dangerous conditions. But those teams are limited, and according to sources, currently not nearby to act quickly. U.S. officials and reporting describe a large military presence in the region, including significant troop levels and major naval assets. But those forces are not trained for law enforcement boardings and cannot substitute for Coast Guard crews. Leaders in the service have warned of a readiness challenge, one that could affect America's ability to enforce sanctions, conduct search and rescue, and combat drug trafficking. The tanker actions are part of a broader strategy. President Donald Trump has announced what officials describe as an unprecedented pressure campaign against President Nicolas Maduro's government. The enforcement of sanctions against oil tankers is a key element of this campaign, designed to cut off Venezuela's oil revenue and pressure the government. Washington argues that the Maduro government is illegitimate and that pressure is necessary to address what it views as democratic backsliding in Venezuela. Critics argue that the sanctions primarily affect ordinary Venezuelans while strengthening the government's narrative of external victimization. Some analysts interpret the move as a wider signal, not only toward Caracas, but also toward Beijing, about influence and enforcement in the hemisphere. By enforcing sanctions and intercepting ships linked to China-bound energy flows, some observers see Washington as asserting hemispheric influence and challenging China's growing presence in Latin America. That interpretation aligns with President Donald Trump's national security strategy and renewed references to the Monroe Doctrine, aimed at limiting non-hemispheric powers' control over strategic assets in the region. The Monroe Doctrine, first articulated in 1823, declared that the Western Hemisphere was off-limits to European colonization and intervention. In its modern form, some analysts argue the doctrine is being invoked to push back against Chinese economic and political influence in Latin America. The strategic implications extend beyond Venezuela. If the United States can successfully restrict Venezuelan oil exports and limit Chinese purchases, it sends a signal to other countries in the region. The interpretation among some observers, Washington retains the ability and the willingness to influence key resources and trade routes in the Western Hemisphere. This is about more than sanctions enforcement. It is about power, influence, and the rules of engagement in Latin America. China has made significant investments across the region in infrastructure, mining, agriculture, and energy. The United States views this expansion as a challenge to its traditional position. The tanker actions are one front in this broader competition. Beijing, for its part, signals it will not yield. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi has spoken of opposition to unilateral bullying and support for national sovereignty, signaling that China has no intention of yielding ground, even in what Washington once called its own backyard. This is a significant statement. China is explicitly rejecting U.S. claims to hemispheric dominance and asserting its right to trade with any country, including Venezuela. The message is clear. China will not be pressured by U.S. enforcement actions. Whether Beijing can actually protect its tankers from seizure is another question. But the diplomatic pushback signals that China views this as a strategic issue, not just a commercial one. Amid the maritime tensions, there are also signs of U.S.-China engagement on other issues. China's Commerce Ministry spokesperson says the two sides' teams reached a basic framework, understanding on handling issues like TikTok through cooperation. The spokesperson added that the Chinese government hopes the companies can reach a solution that complies with Chinese laws and regulations and balances their interests. Beijing expressed hope that the U.S. will work with China to provide a fair, open, transparent, and non-discriminatory business environment so that Chinese companies can continue operating stably in the U.S. The TikTok issue has been a major point of contention between Washington and Beijing, with the U.S. citing national security concerns about the Chinese-owned social media platform. But engagement on TikTok does not extend to all areas of trade. China's spokesperson rejects the U.S. chip tariff plan and criticizes the Section 301 process. The spokesperson stated that the U.S. unilateral tariffs violate WTO rules, undermine the international economic and trade order, disrupt global industrial and supply chains, and harm the interests of U.S. companies and consumers. Separately, the USTR notice outlines a phased approach to the tariffs. China urged the U.S. to correct what it calls erroneous practices as soon as possible and cancel the relevant measures. The semiconductor dispute reflects deeper tensions over technology, supply chains, and economic competition between the world's two largest economies. As tankers are intercepted and energy routes contested, a regional sanctions fight is fast turning into a global power struggle, with oil, oceans, and influence at its core. The confrontation involves multiple dimensions. There is the immediate issue of Venezuelan oil exports and U.S. sanctions enforcement. There is the broader question of Chinese influence in Latin America and U.S. efforts to counter it. And there is the fundamental disagreement over the rules of international trade and maritime law, whether the United States can enforce its sanctions extraterritorially against the objections of other major powers. None of these issues is likely to be resolved quickly. The confrontation is structural, not episodic, and the fate of the Bella One now hangs in the balance. Will elite teams arrive in time? Can Washington's sanctions enforcement be carried out? Or will the tanker's resistance reveal the limits of U.S. maritime enforcement? In the Caribbean waters near Venezuela, the chase, while and the questions traced are far from over. The U.S. shows no sign of abandoning its pressure campaign against Venezuela. Washington views sanctions as essential to its strategy in the region. China shows no sign of yielding. Beijing views the tanker seizures as an abuse of U.S. power and a threat to its legitimate trade interests. Venezuela, caught in the middle, continues to seek buyers for its oil, with China as the most important customer. The Coast Guard's resource constraints add another dimension of uncertainty. If the agency cannot enforce the campaign effectively, the strategy may face challenges regardless of diplomatic considerations. Energy markets will continue to watch closely. Each seizure, or failed seizure, affects calculations about Venezuelan supply and global oil flows. The broader implications extend beyond any single tanker or any single country. What is at stake is the shape of the international orders, whether the United States can maintain its traditional position in the Western Hemisphere, whether China can expand its influence despite U.S. opposition, and whether the rules of maritime trade will be set by Washington or negotiated among multiple powers. These questions will not be answered by the fate of the Bella One alone, but the chase in Caribbean waters is a microcosm of the larger confrontation. As the world watches, the standoff continues. Oil, oceans, and influence remain at stake, and the global power struggle over these resources is only intensifying.